The suburban street I grew up on was always quiet, especially at dusk. In winter evenings came early, and the cold settled deep into the pavement and the bones of our neighborhood. From the outside, our house looked like any other on the block: neat lawn, a swing on the porch, warm light in the windows. But inside, there was a chill far worse than any winter wind. I learned early that love could be conditional, that a mother's warmth could turn frigid and sharp. I remember tiptoeing around the house as a child, afraid to disturb the uneasy peace. My mother's moods set the weather indoors. If she was pleased usually with something my older brother had done, there might be a rare calm, a brief thaw. But if I made a mistake or even just existed too loudly, the ice would crack beneath me. In those moments, I had no safe corner in that house. I would retreat to my small bedroom, my sanctuary of creaking floorboards and peeling wallpaper, hugging a pillow to my chest as I sat in the dim quiet. In that silence, I often wondered what I had done to make her love so cold. My brother James was 4 years older and the undisputed star of our family. He excelled at everything, or at least that's how Mom told it. Soccer team, captain, honor roll, student, charming smile, James had the kind of achievements mothers brag about, and brag she did at every opportunity. I grew up in the shadow of those praises, clapping along quietly on the sidelines of his life. I remember a big soccer game where he scored the winning goal. Mom's cheers echoed across the field for him, while I sat alone on the bleachers, shivering in my jacket, unseen. Her eyes were always on him. At home, the comparisons were constant and cutting. If I brought home a decent grade, Mom would ask why it wasn't as high as James's at that age. If I won second place in the science fair, she'd remind me James had won first place when he was my age. Every accomplishment of mine was just a faded echo of something he had already done better. Eventually, I stopped rushing to tell her anything I achieved. I knew the script by heart. "That's good, but your brother." She'd begin, and my heart would sink before she even finished the sentence. I was living in a story where I would always be the disappointment, the afterthought. Despite everything, I loved my brother in that complicated way younger siblings do. I looked up to him, too. In our few private moments when Mom wasn't hovering, James could be kind. I remember once, when I was about 11, I spent weeks building a model bridge for a school project. The night before it was due, our cat leapt onto my desk and smashed it. I was inconsolable, crying hot, frustrated tears. James heard the commotion and helped me gather the broken pieces. Together, we stayed up until dawn, carefully rebuilding it. He even made me hot chocolate. It was one of the few times I felt I had an ally in the house. In the morning, Mom barely acknowledged my sleepless effort or the completed bridge. She did, however, beam at James with pride for being such a good big brother. I was grateful for his help, truly. But a small part of me felt even that moment, my moment, had somehow become about him too. Small slights became routine. At dinner, if I dared to speak about my day, my voice would be drowned out by my brother's louder stories. "Let James finish, would you?" Mom snapped once when I interrupted. I learned to stay quiet and chew in silence, pretending I didn't mind being invisible at the table. One chilly autumn evening when I was 15, I finally dared to ask Mom the question that had been burning inside me. James had just left to meet friends, and I was alone with her in the kitchen drying dishes as she washed. With a knot in my throat, I murmured, "Mom, are you proud of me at all?" The question hung in the air, fragile as a soap bubble. Mom slowly set down a plate and turned to me with a look more annoyed than surprised. After a heavy pause, she sighed. "I don't see why I wouldn't be, but you do make it hard sometimes. You're not doing badly, but—" She trailed off and I braced myself. James never needed to ask that. He was just someone to be proud of. Her words sliced through me. I bit my tongue and nodded, eyes stinging. I wasn't James, and in that moment it seemed I would always fall short. I just kept drying the dishes with trembling hands. The final blow came 2 years later, near the end of my senior year of high school. It was a gray, bitter January day when I received my college acceptance letter. It was a decent state university, not Columbia like James had managed, but it was something I felt proud of. That afternoon, I walked into the living room where Mom sat at her desk, sorting through bills. I extended the letter with a hopeful smile. "I got in," I said softly. She barely glanced at the page. "This isn't exactly impressive," she said flatly. "Your brother got into Columbia. I suppose this is the best you could do." My face burned. "It's a good school," I whispered. I worked really hard to get in. I hoped my effort would mean something to her." Mom set the letter aside and looked at me as if I were an inconvenience. "Your brother worked hard, too harder. That's why he actually achieved something. You—" She let out a cold, tiny laugh. "Oh, Alex, you'll never be as good as your brother." Her words fell like a hammer. "That's just the truth. The sooner you accept it, the sooner you'll stop stressing us out." Then she turned back to her paperwork as if nothing had happened. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I stood there with the letter in my hand, my vision blurring. My chest felt hollow. I nodded faintly and backed out of the room in silence. In that moment, something inside me quietly broke. As I closed my bedroom door behind me, her words echoed in my mind. "You'll never be as good as your brother." I'd heard that sentiment all my life in subtle ways, but never so plainly. It was as if all those little cuts over the years had gathered into one lethal strike straight through my heart. That night I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent as a tomb. Even the winter wind outside had stilled. I felt numb, replaying her words until they lost meaning. For once, I didn't cry. Something in me had hardened. If I would never be good enough in her eyes, then I had to stop trying to earn her love. I would succeed on my own terms, far away from her shadow. No hope flickered to life in me, only something colder, a grim resolve. In the darkness of that cold, quiet night, I whispered a promise to myself I would prove her wrong. College was supposed to be my escape, a chance to start fresh away from home, but even there, my brother's shadow followed me. With Dad gone and most savings spent on James's Ivy League education, I had to finance my own. While James graduated and walked into a high-paying job straight out of Columbia, I juggled part-time work and student loans just to stay afloat at State. I majored in finance, partly because it was practical, and partly because I hoped succeeding in a respectable field might make Mom finally acknowledge me. That recognition never came. At my college graduation, I scanned the crowd of cheering families for my mother's face. She hadn't bothered to come. In the row of folding chairs, there was an empty seat where she might have been. After the ceremony, I stood alone in the winter cold as classmates celebrated with their parents. I realized then that I was truly on my own. The injustice of it all grew clearer each year. James had every door opened for him. Internships through Mom's connections, a new car on his 18th birthday, full support when he decided to pursue an MBA. Meanwhile, I scraped together every dollar for rent and textbooks. My dinners were often from vending machines when the cafeteria plan ran out. During holidays, I often stayed on campus working overtime rather than returning to a cold home. One Thanksgiving, feeling especially lonely, I called Mom to ask if I could come home for the weekend. She told me it was better if you stay and study since James wouldn't be around, and there was no big dinner planned. I later learned she spent that holiday with James and his girlfriend's family without even telling me. I hung up quietly and spent Thanksgiving Day shelving books at the campus bookstore for extra pay, blinking back tears whenever a customer wished me a happy holiday. After graduating, I returned to the suburbs, hoping to find a job and maybe a brief refuge at home until I got on my feet. I knew it might be a mistake, but I didn't have many options. The economy was rough, and months passed as I hunted for any entry-level position in finance. Each morning I left the house in my one good suit resumes in hand. Each evening I came back to Mom's thin-lipped frown. Any offers yet, she'd ask, already knowing the answer. The disappointment in her tone was unmistakable. Meanwhile, James was climbing the ladder at a prestigious investment firm in New York. He'd recently sent Mom a glossy brochure of a high-rise condo he was buying. She left it on the kitchen counter where I couldn't miss it, a silent reminder of the kind of success that put my situation to shame. The longer I stayed, the more unbearable it became. Mom even began charging me rent for my childhood bedroom, something she'd never have asked of James. "It'll motivate you to work harder," she said, with a thin smile handing me a list of household expenses I was now expected to contribute to. I felt less like a son and more like an unwanted tenant. I picked up any work I could, bagging groceries at dawn, doing data entry online past midnight, anything to keep up with her demands while I continued my job search. But nothing I did was ever enough. One evening, I came home to find her in the living room, holding a letter from a company that had turned me down after a second interview. Her eyes flashed with contempt. "Why am I not surprised?" she said, shaking the letter at me. "It's embarrassing having you here unemployed. Your brother had a job before he even graduated, and you can't manage it after college. Pathetic. Maybe I spoiled you too much. Maybe that's why you're so useless." Her words, so unfair and cutting, left me momentarily breathless. I could only stand there, stomach twisting with shame and anger. That night, I stepped out onto the porch to get some air and overheard Mom on the phone inside talking to James. Through the window, her voice drifted into the dark. "No ambition. I've tried everything. He just can't measure up," she was saying. I clenched my fists in my jacket pockets. "Maybe you can talk some sense into him, James. He listens to you." My cheeks burned with humiliation. It wasn't enough that she belittled me to my face. She had to enlist my brother to fix what she saw as my failures. A week later, James showed up unannounced on the doorstep one Saturday morning. I was in the garage sorting through boxes of old junk, looking for anything I could sell for a few bucks. I heard his familiar upbeat tone before I saw him. "Hey, little bro," he called out, stepping in as if no time had passed. He looked every bit the confident young executive designer coat, polished boots, a watch that probably cost more than everything in that garage. I greeted him quietly. We hadn't seen each other in over a year, and I suspected Mom had summoned him. As we shuffled items around, James chattered about his life in the city, his job, his new apartment, the great restaurants he'd been to. I nodded along, feeling small amid the dusty boxes and old memories. Eventually, he cut to the chase. "Mom's worried about you," he said, leaning against a workbench. "She says you're having a hard time finding a job. Maybe I can put in a word at my company. They could always use assistance or back office support." His tone was gentle, even sympathetic, but the offer landed like a slap. The successful big brother coming to rescue the struggling screw-up. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my pride intact. "Thanks," I muttered, "but I need to handle this myself." James held up his hands in a placating gesture. "All right, suit yourself, just trying to help." He gave me a warm smile that might have been genuine, but I couldn't help feeling patronized. He left later that day after a quiet dinner with Mom, during which I was as usual mostly invisible. When he pulled me into a brief hug goodbye, He pressed a folded $50 bill into my hand. "Take care of yourself, okay?" he said under his breath. I stiffened, unsure whether to thank him or throw it back at him. In the end, I just nodded. The money felt like an indictment of my failure, a charitable handout that burned against my skin. The next morning, Mom was seething. James must have told her I refused his help. I said I didn't need James to rescue me, but she cut me off. She rolled her eyes. "Don't be so dramatic. We were trying to help you," she said, waving off my words. "James offered you a hand, and you threw it back in his face. Do you have any idea how ungrateful that makes you look?" Her dismissal only fueled my anger. "Ungrateful, you've never given me anything to be grateful for." I shot back, voice shaking. A flash of anger crossed her face. "If you just swallowed your pride and listened to us, you wouldn't be in this mess," she snapped. "I'm done with your attitude. I am tired of you." Her words hung in the air, venomous and final. My throat tightened, and before I could stop myself, I said what I'd held in for years. "You've been tired of me since the day I was born." Silence. For a moment, something like hurt flickered in her eyes, but it quickly hardened into resolve. She pointed toward the front door. "If that's how you feel, then you can leave." "Go," she said in an icy calm. "You're on your own now. Maybe you'll learn some respect out there." I stared at her, stunned and trembling, but I didn't hesitate. That evening I packed what little I owned, a duffel bag of clothes, a few books, my old laptop, and I left. Mom watched from the porch as I walked to my car, arms crossed tightly over her chest, saying nothing. I gave our house one last look. Warm light glowed in the living room window, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness I felt inside. Then I turned away and drove off into the night. The suburban streets were silent and frosted with late winter chill. As I passed under the dim streetlights, a profound sense of injustice washed over me. I had been cast out of my own family, as if I were nothing. In my mother's eyes, I had always been nothing. Now finally, I was gone. The weeks after I left home blurred into a haze of uncertainty and loneliness. I drove aimlessly for a while, with no clear destination, just the open road and a numb ache in my chest. The winter skies were iron gray, and the highway stretched out like an endless question with no answer. Eventually, low on money and options, I found myself renting a tiny room in a run-down boarding house on the outskirts of a city. It was all I could afford, peeling paint on the walls, a mattress as thin as paper, and a single light bulb that flickered when the wind blew. But it was shelter, and for the time being, it was mine. In those early days on my own, I learned what loneliness really was. Days would pass without me speaking to anyone. I ate cheap instant noodles and day-old bread to make my savings last. My room was cold. The old radiator in the corner clanked and hissed but barely warmed the air. I often slept in my coat, curled up under a threadbare blanket. At night, I'd lie awake listening to the scurry of mice in the walls and the distant sounds of the city outside, feeling utterly and completely alone. I had no family to call, no one checking in on me. The silence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, there was no one to demean me, no cruel words ringing in my ears. On the other hand, I felt invisible to the world, like if I vanished, no one would even notice. Every morning, I forced myself up with the faint hope that I might find a break. I scoured job listings by the light of that single bulb, circling possibilities in the newspaper until the print stained my fingertips. But the market was bleak. I landed a few interviews in those months, but each one followed a familiar script. Polite smiles, canned responses of "we'll be in touch," and then the inevitable silence. Once, after a promising second interview at a small finance company, I allowed myself a shred of optimism. I imagined calling Mom to tell her I'd finally gotten a real job, part of me still desperate for her validation. But the days dragged on with no callback. When I finally mustered the courage to phone them, the hiring manager apologized and said they'd chosen someone with more experience. I hung up before the manager could hear my voice crack. I sank to the floor and stared at the peeling wallpaper as the weight of failure wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. To make ends meet, I took whatever work I could find. I spent mornings hauling crates at a warehouse down by the docks and nights washing dishes at a greasy spoon diner. The work was grueling and paid next to nothing, but it kept me from starving. Still, I was constantly exhausted and one unexpected expense away from losing even that shabby room. One cold evening after a double shift, I returned home to find a slip of paper wedged under my door, a late notice for rent. I was 2 weeks behind on rent and faced eviction by Friday if I didn't pay. I sat down on the floor, the paper fluttering out of my hand, and finally let out a sob that I'd been holding in for years. All the hurt, anger, and fear I'd bottled up came spilling out in ragged sobs. In that moment, I felt like a complete and utter failure, not just in my mother's eyes, but in my own. I wish I could say that some kind soul came to comfort me, or that I found strength in that moment of weakness. But there was no comfort to be found that night. I was utterly alone with my grief. When I finally ran out of tears, I felt emptier than ever. I eventually crawled into bed, fully dressed, pulling the blanket over my head. I whispered into the darkness questions that haunted me. Why wasn't I enough? Why couldn't my mother love me like she loved him? The radiator's hum was my only answer. In the following days, a numb determination kept me moving forward in a daze. I pawned my last valuables, my wristwatch, an old birthday camera, even my laptop to scrape together rent money. Losing those items hurt. The laptop was my last link to the dreams I once had of making it in the professional world. Now it sat in a pawn shop window among other discarded hopes. After paying the landlord, I had just a few crumpled bills to my name. It felt like every step I tried to take forward, life pushed me 2 steps back. I avoided mirrors. The hollow-eyed man there didn't look like me. Sometimes, on especially cold nights, I wandered the streets rather than return to that lonely little room. Walking kept me warm and gave me the illusion I was going somewhere. One night, an elderly man at the laundromat handed me a cup of coffee and said kindly, "It'll get better, son." I thanked him and tried to smile, but I didn't believe him. Inside, I felt myself slowly unraveling. Each day bled into the next in a gray blur of survival. Any dream of a career felt distant now. I stopped checking email. The only messages were overdue notices and rejections. At one point, I nearly considered crawling back to my mother's house to beg for mercy. But I knew there'd be no mercy there, only contempt. I would sooner sleep on the street than see her "I told you so" glare. My lowest point came on a snowy night about a year into my exile. I had lost my dishwashing job when the diner shut down and the warehouse work dried up. Now I couldn't afford to heat my room at all, and the biting cold seeped through the walls. I huddled by the window, wearing every piece of clothing I owned, watching snowflakes drift past the streetlight glow. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, having finished the last of my bread. As I watched the snow, a wave of despair crashed over me. I thought about James in his high-rise condo, warm and well-fed, with Mom likely visiting him and basking in his success. And here I was, shivering in the dark, utterly alone, with nothing to my name but regrets. That night, for the first time, I truly wondered if maybe my mother had been right all along. Maybe I really was destined to fail, just as she'd said. A dangerous whisper in my mind said there was no point in continuing, that disappearing from this cold world would be easier. I squeezed my eyes shut and shook my head, trying to push away that darkness. A tear slipped down my face, hot on my frozen skin. I wrapped my arms around myself and rocked like a child. In the silence, I could hear my mother's voice. "You'll never be as good as your brother." In that moment, I believed her. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, drowning in hopelessness. Eventually, exhaustion overtook misery. I crawled under my blanket and drifted into a dreamless sleep, not sure I even wanted to wake up. I had finally hit rock bottom, a place so dark and deep that I couldn't see any way out. I woke the next morning to a thin beam of pale winter sunlight peeking through the cracked curtain of my room. My breath still hung in the cold air, but something about that quiet dawn felt different. I was alive. I had made it through the darkest night. In that calm, I realized I had nothing left to lose. I had been stripped of prized possessions and any expectation of rescue. Yet I was still here. If I could survive all that, what else was I capable of? That morning, I decided I wouldn't let that night be the end of my story. I thought of my mother's voice, of all the years I had lived in fear of her judgment. Fear had ruled me so long, fear of failing, fear of proving her right. But I had drowned, and yet here I was, still breathing. What more could her disdain do to me? I had already faced the worst of what I feared, and come out on the other side. There was a grim kind of empowerment in that thought. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was a spark of defiance, and it began to warm something deep inside me. I left the boarding house and walked straight to the public library that day. It was one of the only places I could think of that was warm, free, and welcoming to someone who had nowhere else to go. I found a quiet corner among the stacks and gathered a pile of books and old newspapers. If the traditional path had failed me, if no one was willing to give me a chance, then I would have to create my own chance. I combed through books on business finance and self-improvement with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. I read about people who had pulled themselves up from nothing, entrepreneurs who started in garages and became successes. Every story I absorbed chipped away at the despair that had encrusted my heart. One worn book about overcoming adversity contained a line that struck me: "Rock bottom is a foundation, not a conclusion." If rock bottom was my foundation, I could choose what to build upon it. Over the next few weeks, I developed a routine. By day, I still worked at the warehouse whenever they had shifts for me, but every free hour I had was spent at the library or the nearby community college where I could access computers. I started sketching out a plan for my life, something I'd never truly done before. It began with small goals: find a better job, save some money, get a decent place to live. Beyond those, I dared to jot down bigger ones that once felt impossible: start my own company, become financially secure, prove them all wrong. That last goal became my mantra, not just about my mother, but about reclaiming my worth. An unexpected opportunity came about a month into this new regimen. While browsing job postings on a library computer, I saw a flyer pinned on the bulletin board: Junior Analyst Trainee Program. No experience required. Apply now. It was for a mid-sized financial services company downtown. Ordinarily, I might have scoffed, assuming they'd never pick someone like me. But with my new mindset, I felt a jolt of possibility. I had nothing to lose by trying. I spent that afternoon crafting a resume tailored to the program, highlighting my finance degree, and even the odd jobs where I'd handled money or inventory. Every sentence of my cover letter was infused with genuine passion. I wrote about how handling limited resources in tough times had taught me more about finances and resilience than any classroom could. It was an honest pitch. I poured my heart into it. To my astonishment, I got a call back for an interview. I could hardly believe it when I listened to the voicemail at a payphone outside the library. Heart-pounding, I showed up on the interview day, wearing my one suit pressed as well as I could manage, and a tie I'd bought from a thrift store. I was nervous, but something had changed in me during those weeks. I reminded myself, no fear. You've survived worse. So when I walked into that office building with its gleaming lobby floors, I did so with my head held high. The interview panel asked about my gap after college and my lack of relevant work experience. Instead of stammering excuses, I told them the truth, but I framed it as a story of learning. I spoke about adversity, about how taking menial jobs had taught me work ethic and humility, how being on my own had sharpened my hunger to succeed. I even quoted that line from the book Rock Bottom is a Foundation, and I built solid ground on it. Perhaps it was unconventional, but it was the most honest I'd ever been in a professional setting. A week later, I received the job offer. I remember standing outside the library in the cold, the letter in my hand, my eyes welling up not with sorrow this time, but with something akin to joy. It was a modest trainee position, barely above an intern's pay, but to me, it felt like the first real door opening. It wasn't just a job. It was proof that I could claw my way out of the pit. That night in my drafty room, I allowed myself a rare smile in the darkness. I whispered to myself, "You did it. This is the first step." It felt like placing a flag on top of a hill I'd been trying to climb for years. The trainee program became the fertile ground where I planted the seeds of my future. I threw myself into the work with a vigor that surprised even me. While other trainees clocked out at 5, I stayed late learning from senior analysts, practicing new skills, poring over financial reports, long after the office emptied. My supervisors took notice of my dedication and thirst for knowledge. What I lacked in experience, I made up for in grit. Soon my supervisors began to use words like impressive and promising about me. I wasn't used to praise, but I let it fuel me. Within a year, I finished the program top of my cohort and earned a full junior analyst position. I moved out of the boarding house into a small, clean apartment. I even bought a second-hand laptop to continue learning at home. Each small upgrade in life felt earned and precious. I stayed in touch with a few mentors from the program, soaking up their advice. With every step, my confidence grew. Perhaps the biggest change was in how I saw myself. For years, I defined myself through my mother's eyes, the inadequate son, the disappointment. But as my skills grew, I began to recognize my own value. I could crunch numbers and spot trends, but also relate to clients in hard times because I had lived that struggle. I gained a reputation for being both sharp and empathetic, someone who understood the human side of finance, not just the spreadsheets. With each success, another chain of my past loosened its hold on me. Still, I kept to myself outside of work. I wasn't ready to let new people in. I had colleagues, but no real friends. And I hadn't reached out to my family, not even to James, who sent a few check-in texts that I never answered. I was waiting until I had something undeniable to show them, something that might finally erase the sneer on my mother's face. That day hadn't come yet, but I could feel it inching closer. Late at night in my little apartment, I allowed myself to imagine standing in front of my mother and brother not as a failure, but as someone who had far surpassed their expectations, someone even they might respect. It wasn't just a fantasy anymore, it was a goal. That image fueled me on the hardest days. I fell asleep that winter not in despair, but with quiet determination burning in my chest. The turning point had come, and I had stepped through that door. Now there was only one direction for me to go up toward the life I intended to claim. I approached the next chapter of my life with a quiet, burning resolve. With a solid footing in the industry and a growing network of mentors and colleagues who respected me, I began to plan my next move. It wasn't enough just to have a stable job and a modest apartment. Deep down, I still carried that promise, to prove them wrong, like a brand on my heart. And now I finally had the means and knowledge to act on it. Step one was financial stability. Over the next few years, I lived frugally and saved aggressively. While colleagues spent freely, I continued to live simply. Every spare dollar went into investments. I educated myself on the markets and cautiously grew my savings. By my late 20s, I had a solid nest egg and a reputation as a diligent analyst with a couple of promotions under my belt. But I knew my ambitions lay beyond someone else's ladder. Step two was finding the right opportunity for independence. I noticed many middle-class families were underserved by big financial firms. They worked hard and saved what they could, but were often overlooked in favor of wealthier clients and given one-size-fits-all advice. I understood these people and saw an opportunity to serve them and build something meaningful. Late at night, I drafted a business plan for a financial advisory firm to serve those everyday families and small businesses. My idea was to offer low-fee, personalized financial guidance, combining the analytical skills I'd honed with the empathy I'd gained through hardship. I picked a name that reflected my journey, Phoenix Financial, a nod to rising from the ashes. Step three was taking the leap. Leaving my stable job was tough. I was a top performer, and my bosses tried to entice me to stay, but I couldn't pursue my vision while working for someone else. So I turned in my resignation. I packed up my cubicle while colleagues wished me luck on whatever crazy thing I was about to do. I just smiled. They had no idea how deeply personal this venture was. I spent the first few months laying the groundwork, registering the business, building a basic website, and converting my living room into an office. It was just me at first, CEO, accountant, and clerk, all in one. I tapped my network, spread the word about Phoenix Financial, attended community events, and even offered free workshops on budgeting and investing. The hours were long and relentless, but momentum built. Slowly, clients trickled in: a young couple saving for a home, a retired shop owner managing his pension, a single mother planning for her child's college. I poured my energy into each of them. They were grateful for the help, and word of mouth spread. One client became 20. Step four was expansion. As soon as I could, I hired a small team of people who believed in our mission. We soon moved out of my living room into a modest office downtown. The day I saw Phoenix Financial on the building directory, I felt a surge of pride. I was officially the CEO of a company I had built from the ground up. In a few short years, Phoenix Financial's reputation blossomed. We built a loyal client base and even earned mention in local financial press as a rising firm with a conscience. I gave a few interviews as the CEO, which felt surreal but gratifying. Through it all, I maintained a professional demeanor, never flaunting my success outwardly, letting the results speak for themselves. Inwardly, however, I kept a private tally of victories. Each milestone: the first time our annual revenue surpassed what my brother likely earned, the day we hired our 10th employee, the quarter we broke into 7-figure assets under management. I celebrated quietly alone with a glass of scotch, savoring how far I'd come. Even as Phoenix Financial flourished, I remained a ghost to my family. I hadn't spoken to my mother since the night she threw me out. James and I had gone silent as well. He'd sent a few texts in the first year or two, even a congratulation when he heard I'd gotten that trainee job. But I never replied. Eventually, he stopped trying. That was fine with me. I was not ready to let either of them back into my life until it was on my terms, from a position of strength. I did hear about them occasionally, through mutual acquaintances or social media. James continued on his high-flying path for a while. He got married in a lavish wedding I wasn't invited, of course, and Mom was over the moon from what I heard. I even saw a photo of them on that day, my brother beaming in a sharp suit, my mother glowing with pride at his side. It stung to see how easily I'd been erased from their world, but I reminded myself I was on a different path. Later, I heard James's career hit bumps. A merger at his firm led to layoffs, and he was among those cut. The lavish house he and his wife bought was under strain after their first child arrived, and I heard he tried to start a business that didn't take off. I took no joy in his hardships. If anything, I felt a bit sorry for him, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't quietly validate the path I'd chosen. By my early 30s, a full decade since I left home, I had achieved more than I ever imagined. Phoenix Financial was thriving, I had a comfortable home, and I carried myself with a confidence that no one could ever call me a failure again. But life has a way of circling back. One spring morning, an email landed in our company's general inbox with a very familiar name. My assistant forwarded it with a note about an applicant for our open position. I stared at the email, heart thudding. It was from my brother James, his resume and cover letter asking for a job at my company. I leaned back in my chair. So the day had finally come. The moment I'd imagined in my quiet revenge was here. I closed my eyes and recalled my mother's voice telling me I'd never be as good as her precious son. And now that precious son was unknowingly knocking on my door. I felt no joy, no triumph, only a steely resolve and the echo of old wounds. I opened my eyes and clicked reply, ready to set the final act of my long-awaited justice in motion. I decided to grant my brother an interview, if only to look him in the eye and finally lay the past to rest. On the day of the meeting, I sat in the glass-walled conference room of Phoenix Financial, a place that had become like my second home. Morning light streamed in my reflection, in the polished table showing a composed, confident man. I had kept my emotions in check since receiving James's application, but now I noticed a slight tremor in my hands. I clasped them together and waited. When the receptionist showed him in, I rose to greet my brother for the first time in 10 years. James walked in clutching a leather portfolio. He looked different, older, with new lines around his eyes and a slight stoop to his once confident posture. For a moment, we both simply stared, recognition and confusion flickering across his face. "Hello, James," I said quietly, gesturing to the chair opposite mine. My voice was calm, betraying none of the storm inside me. He hesitated. "Hi, Alex." He sat down, still off balance. I didn't realize the CEO was you. I wasn't expecting this." He attempted a nervous smile. I steepled my fingers and let a silence stretch between us. "You applied for the analyst position," I finally said businesslike. He swallowed. Yes, I did." He attempted a polite, professional tone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to interview." He glanced around the conference room, taking in the logo on the wall, the awards on the shelf. "This is your company." I had heard of it, but I didn't. He trailed off, realizing how foolish he sounded. "You didn't realize I was the one behind Phoenix Financial," I finished for him. There was no malice in my voice, only a cool clarity. He nodded, eyes downcast. "I knew the founder's name was Alex, but I guess I never imagined it was you." He let out a breath and attempted a shaky chuckle. "I should have known. Phoenix, rising from the ashes. It suits you." I didn't smile at the compliment. Instead, I studied him in silence. I could see perspiration at his temples despite the room's comfortable temperature. He was nervous, and why wouldn't he be? He had come unwittingly to ask for help from the very brother he once implicitly looked down on. It was a moment so poetic I almost wanted to laugh at the universe's dark sense of humor. Well, I said, flipping open a copy of his resume that I had printed out. I'd already read it closely and knew the gaps in his career, but I wanted to hear it from him. Why don't you walk me through your experience and why you're interested in this position? James blinked. He hadn't expected to actually be interviewed, at least not by me. He straightened up and began talking, falling into his reflex of confidence. He recited his degree, his years at the New York firm, and his specialties. His tone was polished, but it trembled when he mentioned the downsizing at his firm, a thin veil over his layoff. He glossed over his failed business venture. I listened with a strange detachment, as if watching a familiar play. Underneath his practiced words lay an unmistakable desperation. When he finished his summary, he looked at me expectantly. "I believe I could be an asset to your company," he said. "I have a lot of experience with high-net-worth clients, and yet you find yourself applying here." I interjected, my tone not unkind but pointed. I set his resume down. "Help me understand why James. Why Phoenix Financial?" He opened his mouth, then sighed. "Because I need a job," he admitted, the veneer cracking. "Things haven't gone how I planned. I was laid off. My own business failed. And I know your company actually helps people. I thought maybe I could find a place here. With you." The words hung between us. With you. There it was, an implicit acknowledgement of our bond, frayed as it was. My chest tightened. I realized I had been waiting years to hear something like this, some sign of contrition or need. And now that it was happening, I felt nearly nothing. Just a distant ache and a kind of pity. I leaned back and regarded my brother, truly regarded him perhaps for the first time as an equal. He was not a golden titan towering over me, nor a villain to be vanquished. He was just a man, a humbled man, out of options. And here I was, the one holding all the cards. "Things haven't gone how you planned," I echoed softly. "I'm sorry to hear that." He lowered his gaze. "Alex," he continued quietly, "I know I have no right to ask for favors after how we left things. I regret not reaching out. I regret how Mom treated you. If I could do it over." "But you can't," I interrupted gently. "Neither of us can." I exhaled slowly and closed the folder of his resume with a soft click. James looked at it as if it were his verdict. "I appreciate you coming in to speak with me," I said formally. My words made him flinch slightly, as if already bracing for the blow. "But I have to be honest about what I see." He managed to meet my eyes. "Okay." I stood up, indicating the interview was over. "I suppose there's no separating the two," I replied quietly. "I'm not going to hire you, James." He closed his eyes as if struck. I felt a pang of compassion for the brother I once idolized, but I steeled myself. Justice, not pity, was required now. James rose on unsteady feet, suddenly looking much smaller. "I understand," he whispered, voice raw. He fumbled with his portfolio. "Thank you. For your time." He turned to go, then looked back at me, eyes red-rimmed. "Alex," he said, voice trembling for what it's worth. "I am proud of you. And I am sorry." My throat tightened. Before I could reply, he lowered his gaze and slipped out gently, closing the door behind him. I stood there in the empty conference room, staring at the chair where he'd sat. After a long moment, I moved to the window and watched my brother walk across the parking lot, shoulders hunched. He glanced back once toward the building. I didn't move. A moment later, he was gone. The climax of our story had passed in a quiet civil exchange, no shouting, no dramatics. Only the cold, hard truth finally spoken aloud. It wasn't triumphant or joyful, it was simply necessary. I remained by the window for a long time after James left, processing what had just transpired. 10 years of silent vindication had culminated in a few measured words and a closed door. There was no dramatic triumph, no verbal lashing or grand reveal beyond the quiet truth we both recognized. In the aftermath, I expected to feel elation or satisfaction. Instead, I felt an immense weight slowly lifting from my shoulders, leaving behind a kind of aching emptiness and calm. Justice had been served, on my terms, but it was a somber, heavy sort of justice. I thought of the boy I used to be yearning for a kind word from his mother, a scrap of respect from his brother. That boy had dreamed of a moment like this, fantasized about proving them wrong in spectacular fashion. Now the man I'd become had done just that, but not with fireworks or gloating, just with a simple refusal and unflinching resolve. And it was enough. Perhaps even more than enough. The old wound in my heart felt as though it had finally been stitched closed, though a tender scar would remain. In the days that followed, news of the encounter inevitably reached my mother. I'm not sure whether James told her outright, or if she pieced it together when he turned to her for support. A week after the interview, I received an unexpected phone call at the office. Seeing her name flash on my private line made my heart skip. I let it ring twice, conflicted, before I pressed the receiver to my ear. Her voice came through low and unfamiliar. It had been a decade since I'd heard it directed at me. "It's your mother," she said needlessly, a brittle edge to her tone. Silence hung. She clearly expected me to justify myself, perhaps even apologize. I refused. "I spoke to your brother," she continued stiffly. "He told me what happened, that you wouldn't help him." There was accusation in her words. "Yes," I replied evenly. "That's true." Another silence. "After everything we did for you, you'd turn your back on your own brother when he needed you," she demanded. "Maybe you see it that way," I answered quietly. "I remember when my family turned its back on me." She sputtered, caught off guard. "You chose that path," she snapped. "You left us." "Did I have a choice, Mom?" I asked, a bitter edge creeping into my voice. "All I ever wanted was a little support just once. But you made it clear I'd never be good enough. So I rebuilt myself without you." She drew a sharp breath. When she replied, her voice went shrill indignation, masking hurt. "So this is your revenge, turning your brother away to punish me?" "No," I answered. "It's not about revenge. It's about justice for me setting things right in my life. I didn't do it to hurt you or James. I did it to close the door on being hurt by you." After a pause, she spoke again, quieter. "You think you had it so hard," she said bitterly. "You have no idea the sacrifices we made." I cut her off, gentle but firm. "I'm not doing this, Mom." I didn't answer to argue. I answered because despite everything, you're my mother. I wanted you to know I'm okay. I've made a good life, and I truly hope you find peace too. But I won't apologize for what I did. Not anymore." She was quiet for a long moment. When she finally replied, her voice was tight. "You've made your point," she said coldly. "You don't need us. You never did." I closed my eyes as a tear slipped down my cheek. "Take care of yourself, Mom," I whispered. She said nothing more. Then the line went dead. I sat there after holding the silent phone, my chest aching. There would be no closure from her beyond what I'd given myself. And that had to be enough. That evening, I dug out an old photo album I'd taken when I left home but never opened since. There was James and me playing as little boys, Mom smiling proudly between us. In one, I stood holding a school certificate, looking shyly at the camera, while Mom fussed over James's soccer trophy. Gazing at these ghosts of childhood, I felt sorrow and pity, but also a gentle release. Those days and that boy I was were gone forever. I realized that in pursuing my revenge, I had in fact done something far more important. I had built a life on my own terms, defined by my values and hard work. Yes, I had sacrificed time, relationships, and perhaps a certain softness in my heart to get here. I had become a bit solitary, it was true. My laser focus on success had come at the cost of late nights and missed chances at simple joys. The cost of my justice was real. But looking around my home, modest yet wholly mine, and thinking of the company and community I'd built, I found no regret. This was the life I chose, scars and all. A few days later, James emailed me. He didn't mention the job. Instead, he apologized and said he understood why I did what I did. He hoped one day we might start over as brothers. I read his words with a heavy heart and cautious hope. I hadn't decided if I would respond, but it comforted me that maybe the door wasn't completely closed, that perhaps losing the relationship we had made space for something new someday. I doubted I'd hear from my mother again anytime soon. True to form, she would likely absorb this event into her narrative of being wronged, clinging to pride rather than admitting how her treatment of me had shaped our fate. That was her loss to bear. I had no illusion my silent revenge changed her. But it had changed me. Speaking my truth and standing firm against her anger was the final act of cutting myself free. In the weeks that followed, a sense of peace settled into my life. I went to work without that old shadow over me, and I carried myself with a lighter heart. My colleagues even noticed that I seemed more relaxed, more open. I even took a weekend off, a rarity, and drove out to the countryside to watch the autumn leaves turn. Alone on a quiet road, I let myself feel it all, the grief for a family that never truly accepted me, the satisfaction of having risen beyond their expectations, and a cautious optimism for whatever came next. It was a bittersweet mix, but it was real, and it was mine. In the end, my revenge wasn't the dramatic saga I once imagined. It was a silent revolution, years of steady climb, one decisive moment, and a quiet resolution. The cost had been high, but the reward was a life I could call my own, and the healing of a wounded spirit. Justice isn't always joyful or pretty. Sometimes it's simply the quiet peace that comes from finally standing up for yourself and moving forward unburdened. It's strange how a story that began with so much hurt can end with such quiet acceptance. I've come to terms with the path I walked and the choices I made. In chasing revenge, I found something more valuable, my own strength and a sense of self-worth no one can ever take away again. The boy who once nodded in sad agreement as his mother told him he'd never be good enough has grown into a man who defines his own value. I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if I'd had a loving, supportive family behind me. Would I have still achieved all this? Or did their doubt and cruelty inadvertently forge my resilience? It's a question I'll never truly have the answer to. What I do know is that I don't regret standing up for myself in the end. My decision not to hire my brother wasn't about spite. It was about self-respect. It was the culmination of years of perseverance and personal growth. Would you have done the same in my position? Turning away a brother who once turned his back on you? Do you believe my actions were justified, or would you have chosen a different path? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. I'll be reading them, and I'm genuinely interested in what you have to say. There are no perfect endings in real life. My family is still fractured, and perhaps it always will be. But for the first time, I feel like I'm no longer defined by that fracture. I carry the scars, yes, but they remind me of how far I've come. I can even feel compassion for my brother and mother now in a way I couldn't before. Not enough to let them hurt me again, but enough to wish them no ill. Maybe that's a kind of personal justice too. To those of you listening who have lived through something similar, being the underdog, the overlooked, the one deemed not good enough, I hope my story shows that the future isn't written by those who doubt you. It's written by you. Success, revenge, justice, whatever you want to call it, often comes quietly, step by step. And sometimes the greatest triumph is simply refusing to stay beneath the weight of other people's expectations. Thank you for listening to my journey. It wasn't an easy story to tell, and I'm grateful you stayed with me until the end. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think of my story? Would you have done the same in my position? Turning away a brother who once turned his back on you? Do you believe my actions were justified, or would you have chosen a different path? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. I'll be reading them, and I'm genuinely interested in what you have to say. 10 years ago, I would never have believed that my life could turn out this way. My mother's words, "You'll never be as good as your brother," echoed in my head for so long, fueling my doubts. But now I see those words for what they were, a reflection of her own shortcomings, not mine. If any of you have been compared unfairly to a sibling or made to feel inferior, I want you to remember my story. Remember that no one gets to write your destiny except you. In sharing this story, I've had to confront both the darkness and the light in my past. It's a reminder that sometimes the people who should lift you up might push you down, but their failure doesn't have to define you. I'm curious, have you ever been told you weren't good enough? How did you respond? Did it break you, or did it motivate you to prove them wrong? Tell me in the comments how you overcame or how you plan to overcome those voices of doubt. My quiet act of turning my brother away wasn't about cruelty. It was about self-respect. It was the culmination of years of perseverance and personal growth. Would you have done the same in my place? Or do you think forgiveness and offering him a job would have been the better path? There's no single right answer, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Would you have forgiven, or would you have stood your ground as I did? As I close this chapter of my life, I open myself up to the future with cautious hope. I've learned that healing is not a straight line, and sometimes family wounds run deep. But I also learned that setting boundaries and demanding respect is a form of love. Love for oneself. If my story strikes a chord with you, take that as a sign to stand up for yourself in whatever situation you face. You deserve respect and happiness just as much as anyone else. Once again, thank you for accompanying me on this journey. Please share this video with anyone who might find comfort or inspiration in it. Perhaps you know someone facing a similar uphill battle. Sharing this story might remind them that they are not alone, and that success and justice are possible in the end. Finally, I want to say that hearing your thoughts means a lot to me. This experience, though personal, is something many can relate to. Leave a comment about what moved you or what you might have done differently. Let's support one another in this community. Your engagement not only helps stories like mine reach others who might need to hear them, but it also reminds me, and everyone reading, that there is a whole world of people out there who understand. My silent revenge is complete, and I am at peace. Now it's your turn. Let me know how you feel and what you think. After all, stories like these are meant not just to be heard, but to spark conversation and healing. I'm looking forward to reading your comments and continuing this dialogue with you. Thank you truly for listening. Until next time, take care of yourselves.